Hello everyone, welcome to What If Deku Became the Strongest in a World of Jujutsu Kaisen and My Hero Academia Part 2. Before we start, please go support Zivings for writing that awesome fanfic. Chapter 16. Izuku laid in his bed. It was the middle of the night, and he couldn't manage to sleep. He sat up in his bed and looked at his alarm clock. 2:45. He sighed and swung his legs off of his bed and touched the ground. Standing up, he walked over to the door and grabbed a jacket. Even if it was almost summer, now mid-June, it was still a little chilly at night, not that he wasn't used to it. He walked down the stairs and to the front door where he slowly opened it. He figured since he couldn't sleep he'd go for a walk. Once he opened the door, he saw Ochako sitting on a bench which faced the opposite way of the door. He heard a small sniffle and raised a brow. Uraraka? Ochako froze and Izuku saw her reach her hands up to her face. Yeah? She said before turning around and smiling at the boy. Izuku walked over toward the bench. Midoriya, what are you doing out here? Izuku chuckled as he sat down. I could ask the same, couldn't I? He told the girl as he made himself comfortable. Ochako slowly smiled to herself and looked down. Yeah, I guess. The girl's eyes were red and the bags under them were puffy. It was obvious she had been crying. Izuku looked up to the stars. He smiled. You know, one thing I've done since I was young was watch the stars at night. Even when I was without a place to stay. Ochako looked up at him and saw him staring into the air. She then did the same, looking at all of the celestial bodies. They're so beautiful, the girl muttered, with Izuku chuckling afterward. I know, right? The two fell silent, watching the stars. Ochako's heart was racing. She was scared she got caught. In all honesty, she hadn't gotten over the day she had to save Izuku. Seeing his lifeless body, and having to hold his heart. It was traumatizing, but she thought it was worth it because she got to save Izuku. Even so, she would have nightmares. What if she didn't? Would Sukuna have beat everyone? It made her anxious. So what's on your mind? Izuku asked, turning his head toward the girl. Ochako sighed. Just couldn't sleep, too much on my mind. She then looked back to the stars. Same, do you mind if I ask what? Ochako continued to look at the stars as the silence between them continued. Izuku looked down, disappointed that she wouldn't continue. Back at that mission, having to save you. It was just a lot. Izuku looked back up at Ochako, who was staring at the stars. If I was any later, I might not have been able to revive you, if you hadn't been there. The girl started to tear up. Chances are All Might would have died and the world would have changed. Izuku watched as tears started to flow down the girl's face again. He frowned. Uraraka, I'm sorry if I had been strong. No, you idiot, it's not your fault. She looked at the boy as she interrupted him, tears still flowing down her face. If anything, it's mine. If I had just smacked some sense into you, you wouldn't have gotten fatally injured. Izuku breathed in heavily while closing his eyes. He breathed out and leaned back on the bench. It's going to be okay. Ochako was slightly surprised. Out of everything he could have replied with, that was what he came up with. What do you mean? Izuku opened his eyes and looked over to the girl. Ochako's eyes widened. Izuku was smiling, not his usually smug smile, but a real genuine smile. She felt her heart flutter as a small blush appeared on her face. It's going to be okay, I'll make sure of it. Tears continued to fly down the girl's face, but she smiled at Izuku and nodded. Yeah, it's all going to be okay. The two sat in silence for a few minutes. Ochako shot glances at the boy. She was genuinely surprised that he was so encouraging. Ochako yawned and slowly pulled her phone out of her pocket. Her eyes then widened. It's almost 3. Izuku quickly put his hand over the girl's mouth. He then used his other to put his index finger in front of his mouth. SHHHH, he chuckled as he brought his hand off of her mouth. I'm gonna go take a walk, but you should get to bed, okay? The boy said as he stood up off of the bench. Ochako slowly nodded as she did the same. Yeah, don't be out too late, okay? Izuku chuckled and nodded. I'll be back soon. Good night. The boy smiled and waved as he walked away. Ochako waved back and watched the bow walk down the brick path. She smiled and lowered her hand, placing it on her heart. Who would have thought the boy who almost beat me up a few months back would be pep-talking me? She thought to herself before walking back into the dorms. Izuku walked around campus. He and All Might set up their trip to America a month back, and the time was quickly approaching. Since it was already mid-June, and the trip was the first day of July, so there was only 2 weeks until they left. To find the inverted spear of heaven would be a challenge. All Might wanted to take the legal approach, but Izuku of course just wanted to steal the thing. The American government was iffy, and Izuku didn't think they'd just give him the spear, even if it was to defeat Sukuna. The coveted weapon was held under maximum security. Some of the most powerful quirks in America were holding it hostage. Not that it faltered Izuku's confidence, he went one-on-one with All Might after all. Even though he did lose. In the past few months, Izuku had spent a lot of time learning martial arts with Aizawa. His fighting became a lot more calculated, just as he wanted. He and Ochako sparred a lot, and she was incredibly strong. It surprised him quite a lot because she didn't even have a heavenly restriction. Maybe it was a family thing? He tried not to dwell on it much. After all, he still hadn't ever used a full power punch. Even if he really should have against Sukuna. Izuku looked back at the dorms and saw a single light on. He raised a brow. Had Ochako not tried to go to sleep yet? It had been around 10 minutes since the two said goodnight. Izuku decided he wanted to go back to bed, so he quickly appeared in front of the dorms. He opened the door and saw Ochako sitting on the couch. "Hey, thought you would have gone to bed by now. It's almost 3:30, don't you want to sleep?" He got no reply. He walked over and saw Ochako fast asleep. Izuku stared at the girl before walking closer and tapping her shoulder. She didn't wake up, and Izuku sighed. He sat down next to the girl and shook his head. "How would I explain you just being asleep on the couch? Well, not like anyone saw us talking," he mumbled to himself as he felt the girl lean over onto his shoulder. He glanced over to her. He hadn't really gotten a good look at her face since they met. She had always intrigued the boy. The girl's mouth drooped open and she drooled a bit. Izuku couldn't help but smile. It was a little funny. Funny until she drooled onto his jacket. He sighed and slipped his arm out of the jacket. He then slowly held Ochako's head up while taking himself out of the jacket. Then he slowly put her head down onto the couch, his jacket being used as a pillow. He shook his head and walked out of the common room. He appeared back a few seconds later with a pillow and blanket. He picked up head up slightly and put a pillow under his jacket, then put a blanket over her and exhaled slightly. "You're one interesting person." Izuku turned away and walked to the dorm doors where the light switch was. He looked back to Ochako, who was sleeping soundly, and smiled. "Good night, Uraraka." Chapter 17. "Midoriya, please keep up at least some semblance of etiquette here." Izuku turned to All Might with a devious grin. In his hands he held multiple American cuisine. He stole all of them from pop-up shops in Baltimore, then reappeared in Washington, D.C. within a few seconds, most of that time being used to choose the food he wanted. He opened his mouth and quickly chomped down on a corn dog. He smiled and chuckled while chewing. All Might sighed but couldn't help but smile. This kid. The two walked down the street, closing in near the White House. They were told to meet someone in a big black suit. They would have a small All Might logo on their suit jacket to signify their purpose. Izuku looked around. Such new surroundings were cool to him. He had been all around Japan, but nothing ever captivated him as much as this did. All Might spotted the man they were supposed to meet with and looked to Izuku, who was watching people pass them. "Come on, young Midoriya, I have our spot here." He grabbed Izuku's shoulder and patted it, leading him forward. The man noticed the two foreigners and nodded while turning toward a pathway. Izuku and All Might followed the man, and they eventually ended up inside. Izuku looked around at the walls and saw a bunch of faces. Former presidents from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Izuku couldn't remember, but he was pretty sure the amount of presidents was in the 200 range by now. The two were led to a room which opened up behind a bookshelf. Izuku grinned to himself. How stereotypical, he thought as they entered the room. In front of them was a huge table with multiple people sitting at it. Izuku raised a brow. A tall man with gray hair stood up. Tashinori Yagi, you've come to request something, correct? All Might nodded while bowing down. Mr. President, as you know, Ryaman Sukuna has been found to be alive in a new vessel. The President nodded as All Might stopped bowing. This boy here, Izuku Midoriya, may be our only hope for defeating Sukuna once and for all. Along with the 6 eyes. The President raised a brow. 6 eyes? As in the 6 eyes Satoru Gojo had? All Might slowly nodded. The next holder of Limitless and 6 eyes is alive. His name is Tamura Shigaraki. He is in the captivity of All for One, who is Sukuna's vessel. The President sat down and held his head. Why weren't we notified earlier of this? Because you idiots didn't answer to All Might when he first reached out to you. All Might's eyes shot over to Izuku Midoriya. The people in suits surrounding the President started to whisper amongst themselves. The President chuckled. You're not wrong, boy. May I ask why you are here? What power do you bring to the table to defeat these powerhouses? Izuku smiled and closed his eyes. Then in the blink of an eye he reappeared back in the same spot, but with the inverted spear of heaven in his hands. As you can see. The President's eyes widened as the security in the room armed themselves. I'm not only faster than I can even comprehend, but I can do this. Izuku raised his foot behind him as a crazed smile occupied his face. He then kicked forward. The pure pressure caused by his kick caused a gust of wind to be created. Papers flew throughout the room and the one glass window shattered completely. And that's not even as hard as I can kick. All Might's eyes widened, but the President stayed perfectly calm. Can you also distort your cursed energy or make it undetectable? Izuku shook his head. I don't have any. I have a heavenly restriction. No cursed energy is held in my body at all. The President raised a brow and smiled while holding out his hand. A man with the same powers as Toji Zenin has our trust. Izuku grinned as he put out his hand, shaking the President's hand. You made this easy for me, huh? The boy said with a sly chuckle afterwards. The President then pulled the boy close. His arm encapsulated Izuku's with a metal-like cage. Izuku tried to budge his way out, but the more he did, the more the cage closed, tightening on his wrists. What the hell? All Might was alarmed. Mr. President, may I ask why you're doing this? The President looked over. You think I'd really believe someone like you would just waltz in here and take such a prized possession of America? Izuku grit his teeth and used his free hand to swing at the President. All Might ran toward the two, but by the time he got to them, Izuku's foot was crashing down onto the President's head. The boy had jumped and shifted himself upside down just to kick him. The man's eyes almost rolled back in his head, but he twitched, and they shot back to normal. He smiled as the damage that was done to his head was reversed. He threw the encased arm of both of them up and into Izuku's face. Izuku's nose started to bleed as he fell back to the ground. Some of the men in the back stood up. One of them activated a quirk, and suddenly Izuku's senses were completely messed up. Izuku tried to put his arm down, but it went up into the air. His eyes widened. What is happening? All Might could be heard yelling to his right. He quickly looked over to see no one. He then quickly looked left, and there All Might was. Izuku growled to himself. The man's quirk had completely reversed his senses. Izuku now noticed a recurring theme, his own senses being used against him. First it was in the training with teachers. Now in a real fight. Izuku grit his teeth and stared at the President, who was smiling back at him. I could easily break this, but then I'd have everyone on me. I could always run away, but what about the spear and All Might? What's your move? You're trapped, and I could kill you in the blink of an eye. Izuku stared back at the President, a grin on his face. That's not very politician-like, is it, Mr. President? Izuku raised his head back and smashed it down onto the cage. The cage shattered and the President's eyes widened as blood started to drip down to the floor. Izuku's head was busted open, but he was smiling. Now that my hands are free. Izuku got into a fighting stance and grinned at the President, who was still baffled. Don't think just because my senses are flipped that I won't beat you half to death. All Might got in front of Izuku with his hands in the air. Midoriya, don't threaten the President of the United States, you'll start a war. Izuku disappeared from All Might's view. Shit, the man turned back and saw Izuku with his foot on the neck of one of the men in black suits. The president quickly turned around. Izuku looked down at the man he was standing on top of. You're the one messing with my senses, right? The man was breathing heavily and slowly nodded. Izuku slowly applied pressure. I'd like them back to normal, please, he said with a small laugh. Suddenly he felt his senses return. A scream from behind him caught his attention, and he saw the president on the floor. All Might had punched the man in the face. What happened to not starting a war? Izuku chuckled as he took his foot off of the man's neck and started walking toward All Might, who sighed. I had a change of heart. Grab the weapon and let's go. He turned away from Izuku and started to walk away. Izuku chuckled and appeared next to All Might. You know we're gonna have to get home somehow, right? They won't let us on flights if we just jump the White House officials. All Might shook his head. Midoriya, I can basically fly and you can run on water. We will be fine. Izuku smiled and nodded. Not wrong, sir. See you in Japan. Izuku instantly disappeared and All Might laughed before started to run. Once he got outside, he immediately jumped into the sky. He looked toward the nearest beach and saw a blur on the ocean already. It quickly disappeared from his eyesight and he smiled. Good luck, Midoriya. All Might was then captured in a tall cage. He turned and saw the president with red eyes and his arms extended as if they weren't even human. He looked angry. This might be bad. Chapter 18. Izuku stumbled into the dorms for Class A. It had been almost an hour since he left the American coastline. In that time he visited many different countries, France, Greece, Ireland, where he stopped at a pub for half an hour, and a bunch of others. He yawned. Since he had gotten lost in other countries, it took a lot longer than it should have for him to get back to Japan. Realistically, he could have in a matter of milliseconds, that is if he ran. He arguably could have gotten there instantly. Not that he knew that. Midoriya? You're back, hey. Izuku looked over and saw Ochako with a big smile on her face as she jogged up to him. You're back so soon, are you okay? She asked him while patting on his shoulders. He nodded and brought the inverted spear of heaven up from his side. Look what I got! A smile formed on his face. Ochako's eyes widened. Well, you really got it. Izuku nodded more with a smug grin on his face. Yup, it wasn't too hard. All Might should be back in however long it takes for him to go 6,000 miles by foot. Ochako raised a brow as she brought her hands off of Izuku and down to her side. Wait, by foot? Izuku nodded casually and put the spear near his face. I stole this. So us getting a flight back here was very unlikely. I ran here pretty quickly. I stopped at a few countries in Europe as well. It was fun. Izuku chuckled to himself as Ochako stood there baffled. You stole it? As if on cue, all of the other students walked into the entrance area of the dorms. Stole what? Todoroki asked, confused at Ochako's scream. The whole class saw what was in Izuku's hand and their eyes collectively widened. Bakugo slowly grinned. Stealing? That's not very hero-like. The boy laughed at his own remark as the rest of the class all ran at Izuku. You really stole it? Hagakure and Momo yelled in unison. Izuku felt sweat drip down his forehead. Anyways, now we just have to wait for All Might. Once he gets back, we can explain what happened. Ochako just rolled her eyes. Listen, as you came back, I was about to go train. Care to join me? She asked Izuku, who takes his eyes from the class in front of him and looks over to Ochako. Yeah, let's go. Izuku quickly walked out of the dorms. Ochako looks back to the class, who just sigh. She chuckles and waves as she follows Izuku outside. Izuku closed his eyes and sighed in relief as he slouched his shoulders down. Thanks for saving me back there. Ochako chuckled and shook her head. I wasn't saving you, dummy. I just wanted to train and you just so happened to be the best person to do it with, she said with a small smirk. Izuku glanced over to her and then rolled her eyes. How flattering. Ochako giggled as the two walked to Gym Gamma. So where did you visit on your way back? Ochako asked the boy, who chuckled. Well, France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, those sort of countries. It was fun. Izuku chuckled as they entered the gym. Wow, why'd you go to Europe if you're coming from America? Couldn't you really just run across the water here? Ochako asked, a bit confused. Izuku blinked a few times. I got lost. Ochako also blinked a few times as the two just stared at one another. You're something else, you know that? Izuku just slowly nodded. Anyways, let's spar. Ochako interrupted the small silence that fell between them. Izuku quickly nodded as he took off his shirt and disappeared for a moment. He quickly reappeared with gym pants on, still without a shirt. He put his hand out which held another pair of gym pants. Ochako chuckled and grabbed them. Thanks, I'm gonna go change. Izuku nodded as Ochako walked away toward the locker rooms. The boy quickly ran into the city and grabbed chocolate bar. When he got back, Ochako was walking back into the gym. In training, she used her gym pants and a sports bra for more comfort. Ochako sighed as she saw Izuku bite into the chocolate bar he stole. What? He asked her with a small grin as he chewed. At least share. Izuku nodded, grabbed a second bar from his pocket, tossing it to her as he took a bite of his own. She easily caught it and smiled. Thanks, Midoriya, she said as she ripped the packaging off and took a bite. Her face lit up and her cheeks were slightly red as she smiled. Yummy, she said as she continued to chew. Izuku smiled as he finished eating the bar he had. Alright. Ready? Ochako quickly scarfed down her chocolate bar and nodded. She sounded out as she got into a fighting position. Izuku shook his head while still smiling. You're funny, Uraraka. Anyways, let's do this. Izuku also got into a fighting position. Out of bounds is the edges of this floor, no nut shots, no eye poking, now gravity sucking, understood? Izuku nodded in agreement as they both held their hands out. They locked hands as they walked in a circle. Ochako pounced and got behind Izuku, having her arms wrapped around his waist. He grabbed at her hands and tried to pry them off of him, but she lifted him into the air and dropped him on his back, a small suplex. Ochako slid away a few feet as Izuku quickly recovered. Usually she would try and lock him onto the ground, but she had learned during their previous fights that his recovery time was way too quick. She got back to her feet and was met with a kick toward her head which she put her arm up to block. Izuku quickly shot his other leg up and wrapped his legs around her neck while pulling back his weight toward his body. Ochako was thrown over Izuku and onto her back. Ow, she mumbled as she got back to her feet. She looked at Izuku and saw him smiling as he stretched his shoulders. Ochako jumped at Izuku and the boy caught her. She wrapped her legs around his back and he looked at her confused. You're improving a lot, but don't think you're good enough yet. Ochako smiled before headbutting Izuku. The boy was dazed and let go of her back that he had caught when she jumped on him. Ochako slid up higher and wrapped her arm around Izuku's neck. A guillotine hold. Ochako wrapped her legs around him again and squeezed the boy's neck. Izuku felt the neck constraint starting to halt him. He quickly started to get lightheaded as he scratched at Ochako's back. His scratches turned to punches as he felt himself fading from consciousness. A few kidney punches later he felt Ochako's grip loosen. He quickly dropped himself backwards. He cradled Ochako's head as to not have her land straight on her neck but dropped her onto her back, also falling on his own back in the process. The two laid on the ground panting. Izuku's face slowly returned to its normal color. He bent his head back and saw Ochako holding her back. He rolled onto his stomach and quickly pinned the girl. If it were a wrestling match it would have been over, but this was training so it meant nothing. Ochako grabbed Izuku's arm and rolled over, putting him into an arm bar. The cycle of back and forth went on for a while before the two mutually agreed to take a break. Ochako wiped sweat off of her face with a towel while she groaned. Man, fighting you is getting more and more tiring. Izuku finished taking a drink out of a bottle and tossed it to Ochako, who caught it and started to drink out of it. Gimme that towel, he said while still panting a bit. She quickly tossed it, and he flipped it over to the side she hadn't used and quickly patted down his face. Also, yeah, I think I'm getting better. So I'm having a lot more fun now, he said as he put the towel down. Ochako snorted out a laugh as her breathing finally normalized. Glad you're having fun, Midoriya, but you also better be retaining information on how to fight different styles, Ochako said as she put down the bottle of water the two were sharing. Of course. The boy waved off as he stood up. Thanks again for helping me. Not sure why you randomly knew all these styles of fighting, but I appreciate it, Izuku said as he started to walk toward the door to the gym. Ochako also got up and started to follow him. No problem, you want to go get a bite to eat? She asked the boy, who turned back to her and nodded. Sure, any ideas? The two were so caught up in their own world that they didn't even notice. All Might never got back to UA. Chapter 19. Sir, please listen to me. The man smacked All Might on the face and pushed him back in his cell. You have no right to speak, you're a villain now, Mr. Might. All Might grit his teeth. I'm telling you, what's going on in Japan isn't going to end well. Oh, but I thought your whole plan was around the inverted spear of heaven? Yet here you are saying it won't end well? Then what is the real reason you needed that weapon? Tell us. All Might stared at the guard and closed his eyes. They had put on Quirk deactivating handcuffs, so getting out using one for all was a no-go. He was in an American prison heavily guarded by security. Of course, this was nothing to All Might, but he knew that if he went back to Japan as well, that headlines would be everywhere. For now, they would try and keep it secret until they got the inverted spear of heaven back. I won't let you get away with this, you scum! All Might turned back to the bars of his cell. There stood the president. Mr. President, I insist, I have no ill will toward you or your country. The president bashed his hand against the cell bars, causing a ring to echo throughout the cell. Don't you dare, I'll have you dead in a second, so don't you dare lie to me. All Might stared at the man before closing his eyes. This is harder than I thought. Izuku sat in his room at the edge of his bed. His hands were clasped together, and his foot was tapping on the ground. Do we have any idea where he is? Izuku looked over to Ochako, whose mouth was agape. She couldn't find an answer. It had been a month since All Might was declared missing. No one knew of his whereabouts, and certain people were suspicious of Izuku. Ochako wasn't one of those people. We can only assume he's in America, but even if he was, we both know he could have easily escaped after he told you to leave. Why wouldn't he? Izuku put his hands on his temple and over his face. I really don't know, I don't get it. Ochako just patted his shoulder. She knew some of her classmates were against Izuku in this. Not that she liked that fact. So she wanted to be a pillar of support for the boy. Izuku slowly turned his head toward the girl and sighed. What do I do? Ochako frowned at the boy as she sat down next to him. I really don't know, but I'm on your side. She reached out her hand, put it on his cheek. She slowly smiled. It's going to be okay. He looked back at her with a soft expression on his face. How do you know? Ochako giggled as she took her hand off of his face. We'll make sure of it, right? Izuku remembered a few weeks back when they talked under the stars in the middle of the night. He looked down at the floor and couldn't help but smile. Yeah, it's going to be okay. He then turned back to the girl and stood up. What do you say we go down to the common room? Ochako also stood up and smiled at the boy while nodding. Let's do it. The two quickly made their way down to the common room. Almost the whole class was gathered there watching TV. The conversations that were ongoing slowly came to an end as eyes were adverted to Izuku and Ochako. The room fell to silence as the TV kept playing its program. Izuku started to look down at the ground again. Why do I even care what these people think of me? I'm only here to get stronger. He felt Ochako's hand touch his and quickly looked over to her. She smiled and slowly nodded, making him sigh. Izuku stood up. Are we all serious? Izuku raised a brow as he looked over to Bakugo, who had also stood up and crossed his arms. The class's attention was on him. Why the hell are we suspecting our only shot at beating Sukuna? And that stupid six-eyes dude? Bakugo looked over to Izuku. Listen, I don't like you. I never planned to like you, but I'm not stupid, so I'm on your side here. The boy walked up to Izuku and put his index finger on Izuku's sternum. But boy, if these idiots are right and you did do something to All Might, I'll kill you. Not that you could, Izuku thought to himself before grinning. I don't like you either, Bakugo, but thanks. Shoto stands up. He has a point, and it's one of the reasons I never gave up on Midoriya. If he were to have turned on us the Battle of Kagoshima, and he didn't. Hagakure also stood up. Yeah, if anything, he saved us all from Sukuna already, so why would he turn on us? He doesn't gain anything from doing so. Izuku's eyes slowly widened as he looked back to Ochako, who had a smile on her face. She stood up. For those who are still suspicious, don't worry. I've been and will continue to keep an eye on this guy. She playfully bumped his shoulder with hers and he smiled as well. The whole class shared glances with one another. What the hell, even if he does turn like Bakugo said, it's our only shot to win, so we gotta do it. Kirishima stood up along with Kaminari and Siro. Slowly but surely the entire class joined the side of Izuku. He smiled and clenched his fists. Wherever All Might is, we can be assured that he's alive. If not, then we're gonna get our revenge. Izuku felt tears well up in his eyes, which caught the whole room, including him, off guard. He wiped his eyes and chuckled. All Might has always been the closest thing I've had to a parent. Izuku looked at his palm as memories flew through his head. He's the only reason I'm not still on the streets. He's the reason I want to help by erasing Sukuna. Izuku felt his voice crack and chuckled. If he's gone, I know that I have to make him proud, otherwise all he did was for nothing. No. Izuku looked over to Ochako a bit confused. She quickly grabbed his hand and put it into a fist. Then spinning it around and putting her own fist against it. None of this is for nothing, we got this. The two felt another fist hit theirs. It was Hagakure. Soon enough the entire class had put their fists together. Bakugo was the last to do it, and had one thing to say. Let's beat these bastards. Chapter 20. It had been 4 months since the class united fully. It was November now. Since then they had been training extra hard, and bonded more like a family than normal classmates. It was later in the night and Izuku walked toward the bathhouse. Ochako had harassed him into taking a bath. She even told him she'd come by and make sure he was in the bath just so that he wouldn't lie. He walked into the bathhouse and into the shared baths. He dropped his towel to the ground before quickly picking it back up. He had a swimsuit on as Ochako requested. He went over and slowly got into the hot bath. He slowly smiled as he sat down and let himself soak. Midoriya? Izuku opened his eyes and looked over to the entrance to see Ochako in a towel. Uraraka, he replied as he stood up. Okay, good you're here. She sighed in relief as she walked over to the bath and slowly got in, leaving her towel on the edge. She was also in a swimsuit for obvious reasons. Now listen, you need to bath more often, like every day after training. Izuku's face was contemptuous as he raised one of his lips. Okay, can we drop the act? You know I shower every day. Ochako glanced over at him and sighed. Listen, I needed you alone where no one else would hear us. These shared bathhouses are the perfect spot because no one uses them anymore. Why don't they use them? It's pretty nice in here. Izuku asked rhetorically as he looked around. Mixed-gender bathing went out of style decades if not centuries ago. There's barely any spots around anymore. This is one of the only ones. Izuku slowly nodded while looking at Ochako. So, what did you need to tell me? Ochako sighed as she slowly submerged herself in the water more, only leaving her head above water. Well, I wanted to discuss All Might. Izuku's mood quickly soured. It was November now. They never heard from All Might after Izuku got back to Japan back in July. He was presumed dead, which scared Izuku. In his mind, the Americans could jump at any point. He didn't like the feeling of dread surrounding it. Ochako noticed the boy stuck in his own head, and she slid over next to him. She reached her hand up and put it on his shoulder. I know you're anxious about him, Midoriya, but we really need to keep on the rest of the curses in Japan so that when we fight Sukuna it's a numbers game in our favor. We still need to get those 2 curses we fought back in April. Izuku glanced over to her and nodded slowly. I know you're right, it's just weird, I've never really felt like this, you know, he said as he looked away from Ochako. The girl slowly nodded as she noticed a tear slowly fall down Izuku's face. She bit her lip and closed her eyes before popping up out of the water. She was now just normally sitting next to him. He looked over to her and forced a smile. What was that, F.O.? She interrupted him by wrapping her arms around his head and pulling him closer to her, his head on her chest. Remember what I said, right? Izuku was a bit confused as he felt a few more tears fall down his face. After a few silent seconds he finally got it. He sniffled and smiled as he slowly wrapped his arms around her as well. Yeah, I do. He closed his eyes and just embraced the girl. It was a sense of comfort he had never gotten before. He never had parents, nor a guardian. So when he was sad, he just was sad, but now it was different. He had someone by his side to lift him up when he was down. You wanna wash up? Izuku snapped out of his head and quickly let go of Ochako. He nodded and quickly got out of the baths. He was a bit embarrassed. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Ochako smiled. Want me to wash your back? I can tell you're emotional, so maybe it would be nice for you. Izuku chucked a bit. Yeah, sure, I'd appreciate that. He walked over and sat down on a bench. Ochako grabbed the shower head and turned it on. She put it on Izuku's back. Once she started to scrub his back, she also started to speak. Just so you know, I'm not letting you return the favor, she said as she rubbed his back. He scrunched his eyebrows a bit. What do you mean? He asked her. When I wash up, I can't have a swimsuit top on, and that's not happening. Izuku slowly started to smile. That smile slowly turned into him full on laughing. Ochako quickly joined him, and the two laughed and washed up. Izuku's sour mood had vanished from his mind, and in its place, Ochako Uraraka. Anyways, about the other curses, do you think we should go out on our own while the other train? We're ahead of them by quite the margin, and the more we spar against one another, the more we'll get used to not going for the killing blow. Izuku slowly nodded. I think that could work. It's not as if I'm not used to doing that. After all, I did it for years alone, so I think we will be fine doing that. Ochako then nodded and put her hands on Izuku's shoulders. She peeked over his head and looked down at him. He looked up at her a bit confused. All done. Izuku smiled and nodded. Thank you. Of course, she paused. Now get out, I have to wash myself. Izuku laughed as he got up and grabbed a towel. See you outside, he said as he left the bathing area and went to the locker room to get his clothes. Once the two met back up, they started to walk back to UA. So what's the plan? Izuku looked over to Ochako, who had a smile on her face. Do you want to go talk to the rest of the class? It could be good to get their input on our next moves. It's November, so the school knows what's going to be going on, and might even be making preparations. Izuku slowly nodded while looking away. Yeah, but I am still concerned on what we will do without All Might. Ochako's smile turned to a frown. Midoriya, I know it's hard. She slowly grabbed his hand and squeezed it, causing him to look over to her. You're not alone here. Remember, our class is all on your side. Matter of fact, the entire school is. So you have nothing to worry about. Izuku slowly smiled. He then snorted. Nothing to worry about. Just the entire fate of the country in my hands. He sarcastically threw the hand Ochako wasn't holding in the air. Ochako chuckled and shook her head. You know what I mean, you don't have to worry about being alone. Izuku stopped laughing and slowly put his hand back down. I know, which is funny because my entire life all I ever wanted was to be just that. Yet here I am. Ochako giggled as the two continued to walk. I'll be the first one to say you've changed a lot. Not in bad ways though. When we first met, you immediately beat me. Even your presence was different. Yeah, I also for some reason thought it was cool to belittle you. Sorry about that. Ochako smiled and shook her head. Don't mention it. Also, you can't blame me for losing. I had no idea whatsoever that you didn't have cursed energy. Izuku raised a brow while looking over. So you think if you knew that you would have won? Ochako glanced over at him and rolled her eyes. Never said that. Izuku chuckled at her response as they closed in on the Udata dorms. The hell are you guys doing? Izuku and Ochako jolted a bit and quickly turned around to see Bakugo standing with his arms crossed. Bakugo, we were. She took me to a hot spring. Izuku bluntly interrupted the girl, causing her to burst into a blush. So you went on a date? Nah, she just wanted to talk about things. Hot springs were the most private spot we could think of without being listened in on. Bakugo just slowly nodded. So why were you holding hands on the way back? Ochako was gonna let Izuku answer this time. She looked over to him and unexpectedly, he had a small blush on his face as he faked a cough. It's getting colder out, so we were just using body heat to keep each other warm. Bakugo busted out laughing. You guys are so dumb, he said as he turned away and started walking back to Udata training grounds. Izuku sighed. Nice to see you too. Izuku then looked over to Ochako, who was breathing in heavily as her dark red blush slowly subsided to her normal pink-tinted cheeks. Anyways, let's go back now, she said as she turned away and started walking. Izuku nodded slowly and started to walk behind her. A small blush still painted on his face. A date, huh? Chapter 21. Tamura, it's almost time. Tamura smiled as his eyes widened. Let's take over the world. Back at Udate, Izuku prepared to go out and exercise curses. He put black fingerless gloves on along with a tight black shirt and black cargo pants with a tool belt. Even though the tool belt was useless since he had his cursed inventory, he thought it looked good. He also put on a tight black headband to keep his hair out of his face. He looked into his mirror and smiled as he adjusted his tool belt. A knock on his door gained his attention immediately. He quickly walked over and opened it to see Ochako with a smile on her face. Ready? Izuku nodded as he looked her up and down. They matched outfits. He chuckled. Yeah, let's go. The two walked outside and were surprised to see Aizawa waiting for them. Mr. Aizawa? The two said in unison as the man groaned. Midoriya, Uraraka, may I ask what you two are doing in those get-ups? He said, referring to their choice of matching clothes. Ochako gigged at his comment as Izuku started to speak. We're going out to take down some curses. We're ahead of the rest of the class strength-wise, and what's a better form of training than being in real fights? Aizawa stared at the boy with a blank expression before speaking. Do you have the spear? Izuku quickly shook his head no. Then go for it. Aizawa started walking past the two students and to the dorms. Izuku and Ochako watched him go by and then looked at each other. They both smiled and fist bumped before once again starting to walk toward the exit of campus. I'm surprised the only clause he made us meet was not having the spear, Ochako said with a small chuckle. Izuku nodded in agreement. Yeah, he didn't even ask if I had my other weapons. Izuku smirked. Ochako glanced over to him and saw him stick his tongue out, the cursed inventory appearing on it. She scrunched her face and looked away, making Izuku laugh. Izuku swallowed the cursed spirit again and continued to walk. I don't really plan to use it because I'm supposed to be training, not just beating everything without any effort. Ochako snorted out a laugh. You don't even know if you'll need a weapon against anything but the strongest. You're something else, Midoriya. Izuku smiled and shrugged while putting his arms out. I guess I'm just different, he said arrogantly, which made Ochako laugh even more. Yeah, that's one way to put it. Izuku rolled his eyes as they exited the campus. Anyways, where do we tackle first? Do we split up or do you want to work on coordination just in case? Ochako put her hand to her chin and stroked it. Let's work together. It's more fun. She giggled as she brought her hand off of her chin. Izuku smiled. Alright then, let's get out of here. Ochako nodded and the two disappeared from the spot they were in. Ochako's speed had increased substantially. She wasn't nearly as fast as Izuku, but it was confusing that she was as fast as she was. It was inhuman. The two jumped from building to building. Izuku followed close behind Ochako. She was leading them to the closest cursed spirits. An explosion could be heard in the distance, and the two stopped in their tracks. Their eyes shot over to the explosion, and they both slowly turned their heads to one another. A small smile appeared on both of their faces as they quickly jumped off the building. What should we do? The entirety of Class 1A stood in the common room. They all looked at Ida, who had made the proposition. We need to get stronger now. We can't let that loser fight alone. Bakugo replies, his aggressive demeanor lower than usual. Momo was tense as she spoke. I agree. If we don't and something happens to Izuku, I don't even want to think about what could happen to us. Jiro put a hand on her shoulder and started rubbing it. The close friends both shared the fear. Don't worry, we'll get strong enough to help him or go in and finish off Sukuna if Izuku goes down. Kaminari reassured the girls. Shoto looked down at his hands. A small tremble could be seen before he clenched his fists. He looked back up at the class. They won't beat us. I won't let it happen. Bakugo quickly yelled, startling the quiet students. Neither will I. That bastard will learn not to mess with us. It was a weird way of doing it, but Bakugo's yelling was effective in pumping up the class. Yeah, they all yelled. All Might sat in his cell. His foot tapped against the floor as thoughts raced through his mind. Izuku, I'll be back to help, I promise. Someone walked up to his cell and All Might looked over to them. A small smile crept onto his face. It's nice to finally meet you. Izuku bounced around as the sun set. Ochako followed close behind. Are we heading back to Udade? Ochako asked the boy, who gave a thumbs up as a reply. The two quickly reached Udade and went inside the dorms to see the entire class on the common room couches exhausted. Izuku yawned and jumped onto one of the empty couches, startling the class. Ochako, on the contrary, walked over. Are you guys okay? She chuckled at their reaction to Izuku appearing on the couch. Ida started to fix his glasses that had been tilted due to him jumping. That was quite the jump scare, to say the least, he replied to Ochako, who giggled. The entire class started to talk. Meanwhile, somewhere far away a man stood in a dark void space. Shigaraki. We know when they are going to attack. So how about you leave this battle for me? After all, I am the one they're really coming after. All for One stood across from Sukuna in the mindscape they shared. All for One grit his teeth. I am the one who wants to attack early. I don't care if they have some silly grudge against you. Or think you're the biggest threat. I am the Demon Lord, and once I take over Tamura Shigaraki and steal One for All, we will take over the world together. Sukuna slowly smirked. And what if I don't want that to happen? What are you going to do? All for One slowly started to smile as well. Well, I guess we will just have to see. All for One's physical body opened its eyes and looked over to the calendar on his wall. December 1st. The battle begins. Chapter 22. November 27th. 4 days before All for One's attack. Izuku sat at his desk in his dorm room. He was writing down advice for hand-to-hand combat. Shoto, someone who believed to rely on his quirk too much, wanted more advice. Who better than the boy who had been training in hand-to-hand combat almost his entire life? Izuku tossed his pen onto the table and stood up out of his chair. He let out a breath and started walking to his door. As he did, a knock on it could be heard from the other side. He opened it, and Ochako stood with a small smile on her face. Hey, she said to Izuku, whose eyes lit up as he saw her. She was wearing loose pink pajamas. He thought they were cute. Hi, what's up? Ochako put her hands behind her back, holding them together. Well, the class and I were gonna watch a movie downstairs, to calm the mood since there's less than a month left until our big battle. Izuku slowly nodded. So you were coming to ask me to watch it with you guys? He said to the girl, who quickly nodded. Alright, then I'll be down in a bit. I'm gonna change clothes, okay? Ochako nodded again and waved. See you soon, she said before walking away. Izuku closed his door and a blush appeared on his face. He walked to his closet and started to sort through pajamas to wear. Ochako walked to the stairs and saw Bakugo at the side of the wall she was passing. Be Bakugo? She questioned, startled by his presence. What are you doing? The girl asked him as he just glanced over at her. He chuckled and walked past her and down the stairs, not saying a word. Ochako sighed and followed Bakugo to the common room. She sat down in one of the chairs and Mina started to scroll through movies. The class agreed on one as Izuku entered the room. Izuku looked over at Ochako, and she smiled and beckoned him over to her. He quickly ran to her and looked around to the surrounding chairs. They were all full. He sighed, which Ochako noticed. She scooted over and patted the chair she was in. He smiled and sat down next to her. The class started to watch the movie, but across the country All for One stood with a grin on his face as he watched his successor. Tamura, you have greatly improved. Tamura looked over to All for One and nodded. We will destroy them. A broken smile started to form on his face as the door to the room they were in opened. Tamura looked at the people and smiled. We all will. All for One walked toward the door and past the people who had entered. Don't be hasty, we will have a calculated attack. I will talk to you all soon, he said as he left the room. Sukuna's mouth popped up on the side of All for One's face. So you're giving the brat friends? For what reason? He asked All for One, who just chuckled. Sukuna, I thought you knew me so well. You should know by now that I never run out of options. Do you think I do that by limiting my outlets? Sukuna laughed at the man. The more options you have, the more options that can come back to hurt you. All for One scoffed at Sukuna's comment. I must be hearing things, almost like a dead man speaking, he said to himself, knowing it would anger Sukuna. Sukuna just laughed in reply. All right then. The sun started to rise and All for One looked outside. 3 days remain, until the dawn of the new world. Izuku slowly opened his eyes and blinked a few times. He was still in the common room, but this time he was on the couch instead of the smaller chair. He sat up and noticed a pair of legs next to him. He raised a brow as he looked at his own feet and saw Ochako sleeping. He rolled his legs off of the couch and yawned. When did I fall asleep? He thought to himself as he got up and stretched. He glanced back to Ochako and sniffled. Guess she didn't make it back to bed either. He stood in the room contemplating whether or not he should bring her to her room. He looked over to the wall and saw the clock. 6:50. He sighed. School started in 10 minutes. He walked closer to Ochako and put his hand on her face. He then realized he probably shouldn't do that. Instead, he just poked her forehead a few times. She squeezed her eyes shut. 5 more minutes, she complained as she rolled a bit. Gah, she held her head as she landed on the floor. She looked up and blinked a few times at Izuku. Why are we in the common room? She asked the boy, who shrugged. I guess we fell asleep while watching the movie, he replied before yawning. Anyways, class starts in 7 minutes, so we might want to get going. Ochako's eyes widened. Huh! She quickly grabbed Izuku's shirt and pulled herself up. She turned away and started running to her room. Izuku sighed and ran to his, breezing past Ochako, who growled to herself. Why didn't anyone wake me earlier? She complained as she got to her room. Back in the common room, Bakugo opened the door to the dorms. He raised a brow as he heard the two running upstairs. Why the hell are they running? Don't they know the others are sleeping? It's Saturday, he said to himself before heading toward the kitchen to cook himself breakfast. Izuku finished changing into his school uniform and raced downstairs only to see Shoto in the common room. Midoriya? He asked the green-haired boy, who froze. Wait, why aren't you at class? Izuku shot back. Bakugo could be heard laughing from the kitchen. It's Saturday, Midoriya, Shoto said in his monotone voice. Izuku blinked a few times before cussing under his breath. I'll be right back, he said before racing back upstairs into Ochako's dorm. He knocked on the dorm room door and Ochako quickly opened it. Her hair was a mess and she had her uniform top on but hadn't changed the bottoms. What is it? She asked as she attempted to tie her hair up. It's Saturday. Ochako stopped putting her hair up and the worried look on her face dissipated. Are you serious? She asked, annoyance painted all over her face. Izuku awkwardly laughed. Yeah, sorry. Ochako breathed out of her nose slowly before speaking. Let's get to the gym so I can release this anger on something that isn't you, she said, which made Izuku's skin crawl. She couldn't beat him in a fight, but she was an intimidating girl. Yes, ma'am, he replied while saluting and walking back from the door. Ochako couldn't help but giggle. I'll meet you there in 20, she said before closing the door. Izuku chuckled as he walked back to his dorm room. Neither of them knew of the catastrophic event yet to occur. Chapter 23. December 1st. The day of All for One's attack. Izuku stood in the gym shower with the water running down his face. He felt a shiver roll down his spine, which made him confused. He raised a brow and shut off the shower. He walked out and grabbed a towel, wrapping it around his waist. He walked to the main portion of the gym and saw Ochako walking with her bag around her shoulder. "Midoriya? Why are you naked?" she asked with a small blush on her face. He looked over to the glass on the walls of the gym. "Something feels off." Midoriya had insane senses due to his heavenly restriction. When he was younger, this was horrible as he could barely control anything. He could hear someone drop something from far away without even trying. He got used to it though. This time though the sound was different. Something was flying right toward Yue. Izuku zipped back into the locker room and got on his hero costume. "Uraraka, we have to go," he said as he started to jog to the door. As he did, a huge explosion was heard in the city. The glass shattered and Izuku and Ochako covered both of their eyes. "What the hell?" Ochako said as she uncovered her eyes and ripped glass shards out of her hand, quickly using reverse curse technique to heal herself. She looked over to Izuku to see him also rip out glass from his hands. She quickly healed him. "Thanks, we have to get to Udata now." "Let's go." Izuku picked up Ochako and jumped out of the building and toward Yue. The two arrived and Udata was engulfed in flames. A security system was in place but failed to work. Izuku saw Tamura Shigaraki in the distance, a small smile on his face. "Izuku Midoriya." Izuku turned around and saw All for One standing at the entrance of Yue. "All for One." Ochako looked to Izuku to see him clenching his fists. "Let's go, Sukuna," All for One said as his eyes closed. The signature tattoos appeared on All for One's body. His eyes opened again and a smile appeared on his face. "It's you again this time, let's not have any interruptions." Sukuna appeared in front of Izuku with a crazed smile on his face. Izuku caught his arm, but Sukuna used cleave, almost slicing off Izuku's hand. Luckily, he was fast enough to avoid it. "Now why don't we go somewhere private?" Izuku said to Sukuna, who laughed. "Midoriya, I'm going to help the others with Shigaraki. This might have been a surprise attack, but we can win," Ochako said, catching Izuku's attention. He looked over to the girl who was smiling at him. "We got this," she said quietly. Izuku breathed in heavily. "Ochako," he said to the girl as she turned around. She turned back to him, surprised to hear her first name, and he copied her smile. "Don't die, okay?" Ochako chuckled. "Don't you die either, Izuku. See you on the other side," she said before jumping away toward the dorms. Izuku looked back to Sukuna, who just laughed. "You understand you have no chance, correct?" he said to Izuku, who breathed in heavily. "I wanted to fight someone like you for a long time, and the first time I did I almost died." Izuku put his fists up in a fighting position. "This time things will be different." Sukuna continued to smile but didn't say a word. The two dashed at each other and clashed. The Sukuna from hundreds of years prior would stand no chance against Izuku, but the years and years gone by had strengthened him. Izuku punched Sukuna in the chest, but Sukuna tanked it. Sukuna grabbed Izuku's arm and dragged him to the side. He then elbowed him in the gut, making him kneel down. Sukuna tried to knee Izuku in his face, but Izuku parried the attack and headbutt up into Sukuna's chin, causing him to stumble back a few feet. Sukuna wiped blood off of his mouth and smirked. "You've gotten better. I like an opponent who continues to put up a challenge." Izuku didn't respond and dashed at Sukuna. He swiped at Sukuna's feet, but the King of Curses jumped into the air. Izuku, thinking quick, kicked upward into Sukuna's stomach. Sukuna caught the foot Izuku sent to him, and swung him over his head and let go as he fell to the ground. Izuku caught himself on his hands and kicked down into Sukuna's head, crashing him into the ground. He landed on his feet and turned back to Sukuna, who was already in the midst of getting back up. Sukuna put his hand up toward Izuku and sent a cleave toward him. He dodged the cleave, but as he landed, Sukuna punched him in the gut. Izuku spat up blood as he was sent back multiple feet. Izuku spit up more blood once he got back to his feet. "You aren't gonna make this easy, King of Curses." Sukuna slowly put his hands up. He bent his pinky and index fingers and placed his middle and ring fingers together. Domain expansion. Izuku got ready to run as Malevolent Shrine took over the area. He started to run but realized that the domain kept expanding. Izuku looked back to Sukuna, who had a devious grin on his face. Cleave and dismantle started to rain down on Izuku, and he grit his teeth in pain. Cuts and slashes appeared all over his body, and he fell to his knees. Sukuna appeared in front of Izuku as the domain was manually disbanded. The fact that you aren't in slices on the ground is impressive enough, Sukuna said to the boy who looked up at him. But you're still conscious. Maybe the best wasn't the right choice. He laughed as he put his hand out toward Izuku. My turn. The tattoos disappeared off of Sukuna and his face became annoyed as it changed back to All for One's facial structure. Izuku Midoriya, once my plan is completed you will never see another day, All for One said to the boy as he activated the tendril quirk and stabbed into Izuku's stomach. Izuku coughed and fell onto his face. I tried so hard, why can't I win? He clenched his fists. Now I will go eliminate your classmates and find All Might. Once I steal one for all and obtain limitless and 6 eyes, I will rule this world. All for One starts to walk past Izuku but feels a tug on his pants. He slowly turns and sees Izuku with his face still on the ground, his hand gripping onto the pant leg as if it were a desperation move. I won't let you! Izuku coughed up more blood as he slowly looked up at All for One. Hurt my friends? All for One smiled. How charming, young man, but there is nothing you can do anymore. All for One grabbed the boy by his hair and brought him into the air. You aren't worthy of saving your friends. Ha 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 ha! All for One's eyes widened as he looked over to the noise's source. All Might stood with a woman his height and stature next to him, and multiple heroes behind him. Young Midoriya. We were late, for that I apologize. All for One grit his teeth and Izuku laughed as tears streamed down his face. All Might. He sniffled as he started to fade from consciousness. I'm so happy you're alive. Chapter 24. Ochako stood across from Shigaraki. Behind her was the entirety of Class 1A. Guys, we need to find a way out of here, she said to the class. Luckily for them, it was after classes, so almost everyone was gone. Evacuations had taken place so that there were only Hero Course students left. I'll buy time, you guys run. Ochako started to run at Shigaraki. The man's face was monotone as he put up his hand. He bent back his middle finger, using his thumb to push it down. Ochako stopped and watched the man as he closed his eyes. An energy started to build up in his hand. Shigaraki's eyes opened as the huge bubble-shaped formation appeared on his middle finger. Blue. He flicked and the large mass flew at Ochako, who quickly started to run back. The blue started to destroy everything around. Run, Ochako yelled to her classmates. The class dispersed. Momo ran to where a secret room was and found a certain item she needed to produce. She breathed in heavily and started to mass-produce them. Ochako ran toward the entrance of the school and saw Izuku being carried back toward a group of people who looked to be heroes. She was confused until she saw All Might fighting All for One. Her yes widened. He's alive. Ochako ran to where Izuku was being treated with RCT and started to help. Come on now, it hasn't been long, you need to wake up, she said as the boy started to open his eyes. Uraraka? He asked as he put a hand on his stomach. He hissed in pain as he was being healed. All for One grit his teeth as he cranked back his fists. The huge explosions of purple in the back made it hard to hear. All Might, he screamed as the number 1 hero also cranked back his fist with his signature smile plastered on his face. Did you miss me? All Might threw his fist into All for One's face as he dodged All for One's attack. Blood splattered off of All for One's face as the two flew past each other. All for One collapsed to the ground. Izuku suddenly popped up off the ground. He shook his head a bit and looked to All for One to see the man's entire head covered in blood. Midoriya! All Might could be heard saying from where he stood. Izuku jumped to him. All Might, he said to the man who slowly turned to him. Izuku couldn't hold back his tears. He hugged All Might, who was surprised. Midoriya, he said again, hugging the boy back. Aizawa landed next to the pair. Hate to break this up, but we got more problems on our hands, the man said as he activated his quirk on All for One. All for One stood with heroes in front of him. He was calm, almost too calm. He slowly turned to All Might. You disappear for months only to appear at the perfect time. The man's voice grew as he spoke. How did you know? How did you predict my surprise attack? Izuku glanced to All Might. He kind of wondered the same thing. Because today is our anniversary. All Might smiled. The day that I took your face back to the Hero Association. All for One grit his teeth at the mention of their first encounter. If it weren't for reverse curse technique, he wouldn't have a face anymore. All for One growled. All Might. The man's calm demeanor disappeared. For every Superman there is his kryptonite. All Might was All for One's kryptonite. All for One charged at All Might, and the two clashed again. Midoriya, Uraraka, take over here, I need to go fight Shigaraki. All Might told the two students who looked at each other. They both nodded and Izuku appeared behind All for One. He kicked the man in the head and bashed him away. Ochako ran toward the two as All Might and the heroes from America fled to Shigaraki, who was at the other side of the campus. Izuku jumped back and landed next to Ochako as All for One became enraged. You think you can step to me? You're nothing. Tendrils shot from the man's hands, but both Izuku and Ochako jumped around them. I got the left, you know what to do, Izuku told Ochako before disappearing. As Izuku appeared behind All for One, he was stabbed by tendrils again. Ochako appeared in front of the man and punched him in the gut. He growled as Izuku, who was still behind him, punched straight through his back. With Izuku's hand through the man, Ochako grabbed it and healed Izuku, who then ripped it back through All for One, who coughed up blood. Tattoos appeared on his face as Sukuna took back over. RCT immediately regenerated the hole in his chest, and he threw his elbow back, cracking Izuku's jaw. Ochako touched Sukuna and changed his gravitational pull. Sukuna tried to resist as Ochako's quirk took its effect. He grit his teeth and put out his arm, barely able to send off a dismantle before he was crushed into the ground. Izuku popped his own jaw back into place and shook a bit. Sukuna started to laugh and started to bring his hands together. Ochako copied him as she jumped back. Domain expansion. Both do their domains expanded. Ochako's quirk effect wore off and Sukuna easily got back to his feet. The large shrine of Malevolent Shrine appeared. Izuku jumped away from it and looked over to see the other battle between All Might the heroes and Shigaraki. I think it's time to take things into my own hands. Sukuna disappeared from Ochako and Izuku's view and next to Shigaraki. Shigaraki looked at the man confused as he ripped his finger off and smiled. Down the hatch. Sukuna shoved his finger inside of Shigaraki's mouth and held it down. Shigaraki swallowed and his eyes widened as the tattoos on All for One's body disappeared. Shigaraki's eyes closed and his head dropped as the Malevolent Shrine domain expansion dissipated. Izuku and Ochako ran over to see All for One on the ground and Shigaraki slowly looking up, a smile appearing on his face. Sukuna's signature tattoos started to appear on Shigaraki's face. He put his hand up as everyone stood in shock. He bent his middle finger and held it back with his thumb. 9 ropes. Polarized light. Crow and Shomyo. The gap between within and without. Imaginary technique. Sukuna's grin grew as the mass on his finger did as well. Hollow purple. Chapter 25. Izuku's ears rang. The explosions before were loud enough, but this technique purple, it was nothing he had ever faced before. Izuku turned around and saw multiple bodies on the ground. The American heroes had been all but wiped out. A man could be seen sliding around trying to save people, but he couldn't get them all. All Might stood in awe. For the first time since he first inherited his quirk, he felt something. Fear. Izuku looked to Ochako, who had already started running at Sukuna. Sukuna turned to her and smiled. Ochako tried to punch him, but something got in the way. Infinity. Ochako's eyes widened as her punch wouldn't hit him. Izuku grabbed her and jumped away, leaving the scene. Sukuna watched them flee and smiled. He then looked over to All Might and the few remaining heroes. He put up his left hand and wrapped his middle finger around his index finger. Domain expansion. The entire battlefield was ripped into a domain. Infinite void. If it weren't for Izuku's speed, he and Ochako would have been trapped as well. Ochako breathed heavily and looked to Izuku, who was staring at the ground with wide eyes. Sukuna fought Sapporo Gojo centuries ago. How does he know how to use the limitless 6 eyes? Not even Tamura Shigaraki showed that much skill. Ochako looked over to the outside of the domain expansion. Do you know what Gojo's domain did? She asked Izuku, who also looks over to the domain. If it's what I remember, then we need to break it. Ochako nodded. I'm going to go find Momo. We need them more than ever now, Ochako said as she turned back to Izuku, who nodded. I'll break this thing no matter how hard I have to hit it. Ochako smiled before jumping away. Izuku turned to the domain expansion and breathed in heavily before throwing a punch. He hit the domain and the ground around him shook, but the domain didn't budge. Izuku grit his teeth and hit it again. The ground shook even more as rubles started to fall from the buildings around him. Come on, he said as he started to punch more and more. The ground started to shake more and more to the point where it felt like an earthquake. Izuku grit his teeth. Break, damn it. One final punch broke the domain open, and as shards rained down, Izuku saw Sukuna with All Might's neck in his hand. He was holding the man up with a dead stare on his face. He dropped the man to the ground, who seemed to shrink in size. Around the battlefield, the few heroes left standing were now on the ground. Only one stood, a woman who was built like All Might. Sukuna laughed as the woman had tears dripping down her face. Let go of my master, she said as Sukuna's laugh quieted down. Your master is a pathetic version of himself right now. If that's what I can do, then what could you do to me? Izuku watched as the two spoke. How wasn't she affected by his domain expansion? He thought to himself as the woman grit her teeth. New order: if Ryaman Sukuna moves, he will cease to exist. Sukuna's smile never faded. He started to walk toward the woman. This body inhabits 2 souls, and if I understand your power, then you only have 2 orders at once. The man laughed to himself. So if you incapacitate me fully, you'll be back to a normal person. So choose wisely what you do next. The woman seemed taken back by his analysis of her quirk. Sukuna appeared in front of her with his hand up in the same position. He fire off purple. Reversal, red. The woman was thrown away from the red and into the crumbling remains of Yui. Sukuna then turned his sights to Izuku. You broke my domain, impressive. He smiled as he put his hand up and used Shrine. Cut slashed into Izuku's chest, but he didn't react. Sukuna squinted his eyes slightly, wondering what Izuku was doing. Suddenly, before Sukuna could even react, Izuku was in front of him with his arm cranked back and his eyes wide. Die! The punch he threw was blocked by Infinity but got dangerously close to Sukuna. He looked at Izuku with wide eyes. Don't tell me you still haven't gone all out. Sukuna smiled and laughed as he grabbed Izuku by the side and squeezed down, crushing his side. Izuku spat up blood but barely reacted. You are nothing to me. Izuku grabbed Sukuna's hand that Sukuna foolishly didn't take off of him and ripped it off of him. Sukuna jumped back and used RCT to bring his arm back. He stared at Izuku as the boy's guts hung out of his side. How are you alive? Izuku didn't answer. He just stared at Sukuna. Remember what I said? Sukuna raised a brow. Izuku opened his mouth and started to laugh, blood pouring out as he did. I won't let you hurt my friends. Sukuna felt a presence behind him. He slowly turned away and saw the entirety of Class 1A. They all had weapons in their hands, and Sukuna laughed as he looked back to Izuku, who grinned. And they won't let you hurt me. You're so like him, Sukuna said as Ochako landed next to Izuku and started to use RCT to heal his wounds. Izuku glanced over to Ochako, who was staring down Sukuna. I told you not to die, Izuku, she muttered to Izuku as she healed him. Izuku chuckled and looked to Sukuna again. Don't worry, Ochako, I'm still alive and kicking. Sukuna appeared in front of Izuku and Ochako and slightly extended his domain, pushing Ochako back away from Izuku. The heat in the area started to rise and Sukuna turned around. There stood Shoto Todoroki with fire shooting out of his side and Katsuki Bikugo with explosions popping in his hands. Sukuna sighed. Damn brats. Chapter 26. All Might laid on the ground staring into the air. He suddenly appeared in a dark space. Tashinori. All Might's eyes that were slowly closing opened wide. He could recognize that voice from anywhere. Master, he mumbled as he continued to stare into the air, which was now pitch black. Stand up, Tashinori, the voice said, confusing All Might. He sat up and looked around to see 7 chairs. Where am I? He said to himself. Welcome to the core. We are within one for all. All Might stared at his predecessor. Shimura, tears started to form in his eyes. Nana smiled at Tashinori. It's good to see you, kid, but now is finally the moment. Tashinori might not have seen the One for All mind space before, but he knew what was happening next. This is it, isn't it? Nana nodded as more people appeared. Tashinori Yagi the Eighth, it is time to complete One for All. All for One opened his eyes and stood up off of the ground. This isn't how it was supposed to go. He looked over to where All Might had been lying before, but before his eyes could get there, All Might punched him in the face, sending him flying back. He landed and rolled back even farther. Once he got to his feet, he saw All Might standing in a fighting stance. The man's usually stuck-up hair was down, and he had a shine in his eyes that All for One hadn't seen in a long time. Red energy was formed around his legs and arms. His arms were coated with a black and green whip. His eyes had energy pouring from them. All for One laughed as he saw the spirits of the previous One for All users behind All Might. The others finally decided to come out to play, huh? All for One's laugh continued to echo as he started stocking quirks of his and activating them. Then let's play. Sukuna held his arms in front of him to block the incoming explosions from Bakugo. As he went for a counter-attack, Shoto used his eyes to catch it. The two were both stalling so that Izuku and Ochako could recuperate. Sukuna put his hand up and activated Cleave and Dismantle out of habit. It grazed both Shoto and Bakugo's faces but didn't hurt them. If it weren't for Shoto's eyes, the two might have been dead. Sukuna became aggravated. He sensed a strange cursed energy and turned around, and instead of seeing the source of said cursed energy, he turned to see Ochako in front of him with wide eyes. Black sparks shined on her fist, and Sukuna thought back to his mortal enemy. The boy who truly got rid of him for years. Sukuna didn't have time to react, and Ochako hit him with the black flash. He flew back farther than anyone expected. He grit his teeth. The girl's punch shouldn't have been as painful as it was. A normal black flash would never have done this much to him. Sukuna slowly got up and looked at Ochako. Girl, what is your name? Ochako breathed heavily. Ochako Uraraka. Sukuna started to focus in more on her cursed energy. He slowly started to laugh. I knew there was always something familiar about you. Her cursed energy was a spitting image of him. As Ochako ran towards Sukuna again, the black sparks coated her hand. Black flash, she roared this time. Izuku and the others watched in awe. Sukuna grit his teeth and blocked the black flash with his arms. Why isn't Limitless working? He thought to himself as Ochako flung him back into a wall. Izuku looked to Sukuna with a small smile and stuck his tongue out a tiny bit. Sukuna started to scan his body and felt a small shard in his leg. He pricked it out and slowly recognized the cursed energy. This is... How did you get this? Izuku started to laugh as Ochako pummeled Sukuna with black flash after black flash. Sukuna grit his teeth and swung back at Ochako, hitting a black flash of his own. He then put his middle finger around his index. Domain expansion. Ochako put her hands together. Domain expansion. The two domains clashed. Ochako barely could stand, but Izuku appeared behind her and pushed her back, keeping her on her feet. Ochako glanced behind herself and saw Izuku looking at her with a small smile. He nodded and Ochako looked back to Sukuna with a newfound confidence. Suddenly All for One flew into Sukuna and the two went into a wall. Izuku and Ochako's eyes shot over to where All for One came from and saw All Might. Whoa, Izuku mumbled, seeing the state he was in. All Might instantly appeared next to the two villains and smashed down into the ground. Once the smoke cleared, Sukuna stood behind All Might with an unsatisfied look on his face. He slowly turned to Izuku and Ochako. He pointed at Izuku. You're the only one who entertains me. Izuku raised a brow. You want a one-on-one? He asked Sukuna, who grinned. We both know you wouldn't adhere to a fair one-on-one. Izuku chuckled. You got me, he said, putting up his hands before disappearing and appearing behind Sukuna. Sukuna activated Infinity, but Izuku stabbed a certain blade in his back, causing him to spit up blood. Ochako jumped onto Sukuna and used her quirk to crush him into the ground, where Izuku then stabbed him in the neck with the inverted spear of heaven. Sukuna smiled as blood poured from his neck. He then gargled a bit of it and spit it right into Izuku's face. Izuku flinched after not expecting the blood, and Sukuna took the opportunity to pump up his RCT and heal his neck. He kicked Ochako in the crotch and sent her flying up. Don't think that damn spear is gonna stop me. Sukuna had an evil grin on his face as he cranked back his arm and hit Izuku in the stomach. Black sparks flew around and Izuku spat up the saliva in his mouth and flew back. As Ochako landed, she blinked a few times and held her lower stomach in pain. Izuku landed next to her and glanced over. Guess it works on girls too, huh? Izuku laughed to himself. He spat up blood and blew air out of his mouth. Izuku looked over to see All Might and All for One scrapping. The black whips coming from All Might confused Izuku, but he couldn't muster the energy to think about it. He rolled over and stopped next to Ochako, who reached over and placed her hand on his chest. I wish I didn't need to do this for you, Ochako said as she started to heal Izuku. Izuku laughed. You don't mind too much though, he said as Sukuna started to put his hand up. Ugh. Hollow purple, Sukuna said, skipping the chant and shooting it toward the two. Izuku looked over to Ochako, who was staring back. You gonna let us die? She asked, and he shook his head before the two disappeared from the spot. Izuku watched the hollow purple and then looked back to Sukuna, who had an annoyed look on his face. Here I thought having this body would make me unbeatable, Sukuna said as he looked over to All for One, who stared back at him. All for One slowly smiled. Time's ticking, he said before once again being punched in the face by All Might. All Might grabbed him with Black Whip and started to strangle him before smashing him into the ground. All for One felt his conscience start to float in his mind. He held his stomach and continued to laugh. All Might stared at the man furious. All for One opened his mouth wide and tendrils shot out and into All Might's chest, causing him to retract off of him. All for One used reverse curse technique to heal himself before standing up. He cracked his neck and looked to All Might, who was also starting to heal. All for One grinned and got into a fighting stance. Let's go. Chapter 27. All Might's fists crashed into All for One's face. The wind blew fast as snow started to fall. A chill ran down All Might's spine. A clash of punches caused a ring to flow through All Might's ears. He looked over and saw Sukuna going blow for blow with Izuku. Izuku had started to time his punches so that they'd hit Sukuna as soon as Infinite dropped. Since it was such a small incline of time, he wasn't able to hit a full-powered punch, but did damage nonetheless. Maybe if you were around back then Shinjuku wouldn't have happened. Sukuna laughed as he used RCT to heal himself while still hitting Izuku. Izuku didn't answer. He had a dangerous glint in his eyes. He pulled his arm back and punched towards Sukuna. Before he connected, a blade appeared in his palm and he stabbed in straight into Sukuna's eye. Sukuna hissed in pain. How the hell? Izuku didn't answer. He had started going so fast that it was basically teleportation. He had gone to where Momo was. She had been tasked with one of the most important parts of this battle: duplicating the inverted spear of heaven. With Momo's almost perfect duplication of even the cursed energy used, it was impossible to tell which was real. Sukuna was pummeled with multiple punches at once. Holes appeared in his stomach and blood poured everywhere. Sukuna ripped the blade out of his eye and grit his teeth. He cranked back his fists and punched Izuku, sending him flying back. He then threw the part of the spear away and tried to use RCT. Before he could, he was stabbed through the back of the heart. He spat up blood and turned to see Izuku, his normal arrogant smile gone as blood dripped down his mouth and onto the ground. Sukuna elbowed Izuku in the jaw, breaking it. The jaw hung loose as Izuku pushed the blade deeper into his back. Sukuna elbowed Izuku one more time, but this time his jaw completely ripped off and he was sent flying back. Izuku laid on the ground limp. Thoughts raced through his mind. He wasn't going to lose. He couldn't leave his friends. He didn't want to die. He wanted to win. He felt a surge of energy run through him and pushed himself up into a standing position. Blood drained from his mouth, but he didn't care. Breathe. Izuku appeared in front of Sukuna and grabbed at his heart. He squeezed it, but Sukuna pumped RCT into it all he could, focusing on purely his heart. Sukuna was smiling at Izuku's state. Izuku had a blank expression. He ripped his hand out of Sukuna again and headbutted him. Ochako watched in horror. Her heart was racing as she saw Izuku without the bottom half of his jaw. It was horrifying. She ran and jumped to Izuku, appearing behind him and putting her hand on the back of his shoulder. She couldn't bear to look at the front of him while he was like this. She pumped RCT through the boy and his jaw reformed. He felt a shiver up his spine and turned to Ochako with tears in his eyes. Thank you," he muttered, with Ochako just nodding in response. Izuku looked to Sukuna, who was smiling. "I guess I'll have to take this brat out first if I want to kill you," he said to Izuku, who stayed calm and put his fists up. "Try." Izuku appeared in front of Sukuna, and the two clashed fists again. "Isn't this getting repetitive?" Izuku asked, with Sukuna just grinning back at him. Sukuna smiled and jumped back. He put his hand up and used cleave and dismantle to destroy the remains of UA. "Then let's change pace," he said as he weaved hand signs and flames appeared in his hands. He put his arms in a position to where it looked like he was going to fire an arrow. Fuga. Don't tell me he still has access to his other techniques, Izuku thought to himself as he appeared in front of Sukuna and kicked his arm down, causing Sukuna to shoot the Fuga straight into the ground, creating a huge hole in the process. Smoke flew from the hole and Izuku looked into the ground to see it completely destroyed. Izuku looked into the hole and an idea popped into his mind. He grinned and jumped into the hole. Sukuna grinned and walked to the edge of the hole. He jumped down, following Izuku. All Might sent Black Whip around All For One's neck and squeezed. "All For One, you're done for," he claimed as he squeezed harder. All For One smiled as tendrils shot from his fingertips and through All Might's throat. His eyes widened as he felt air fly through his throat and out the back of his neck. "Looks like we're both done for." All For One smiled and laughed. "Not if I have anything to say about it." All For One turned and saw Ochako flying at him with her fist cranked back. Cursed energy coated her fist. Black flash. The sparks of black flew as Ochako's fist crashed into All For One's head. Something was different about Ochako. All Might looked over and saw the girl gritting her teeth while breathing heavily. Cursed energy started to envelop her entire body. A chill ran down her spine and her eyes widened slightly more as she looked to All Might. All Might was stunned. The girl had used too much cursed energy. Her body should have been on the brink of failure. Instead, it seemed like she hadn't even reached her peak. "What are you?" All Might mustered out as his throat bled. Ochako disappeared before All Might could finish speaking. He looked over and saw Ochako with black sparks flying around her hand as she punched a hole into All For One's chest, straight through his heart. Tendrils shot into Ochako's stomach from All For One's falling hands. She maintained reverse curse technique to heal herself as she squeezed on All For One's heart. She thought back to a lesson she was taught by Izuku when they were finding curses. The one way to 100% prevent someone from using RCT. Ochako slowly looked at All For One's head and smiled. Was to go for the head. Chapter 28. Izuku headbutted Sukuna, who felt lightheaded. Sukuna grit his teeth and punched Izuku in the face, using infinity to push him through the bedrock that surrounded them. They were at least 1,000 feet underground. The Fuga would have easily destroyed the school and even more. Izuku fell to his knees and grinned before swinging at Sukuna. Sukuna dodged easily and the bedrock behind him was destroyed. Izuku grabbed the inverted spear of heaven from his cursed inventory, which had been kept in his pants. He turned to where Sukuna had jumped and slashed at him. A cut appeared on the man's face and he growled in dissatisfaction. He activated Limitless again but kept his hands down. Izuku looked at his hands, anticipating either blue or purple. Once he saw neither, he looked back to Sukuna's face to see him grinning. He then looked down to Sukuna's feet and saw red staring back at him. Izuku's eyes widened and he put the inverted spear in front of his face to protect him as red flew at him. The arm holding the blade got mangled as red hit it. Izuku grit his teeth and hissed as he instantly appeared 100 meters back. He looked at his arm and saw the bones sticking out in multiple places. He breathed in heavily and sliced the arm completely off from the elbow down. He took the top half of his clothing off and wrapped it around the wound as tight as he could. He picked the inverted spear back up with the remaining hand and looked up to see the hole left by Fuga. His eyes widened and he smiled. Sukuna appeared in front of him and punched him in the stomach. "What the hell are you smiling for?" he said with his own smile. "I've won." Purple started to form in Sukuna's hand and Izuku jumped out of the way and started to run to the hole filled with bedrock from earlier. Sukuna turned to Izuku and shot off purple. Izuku smiled and looked up. He breathed in heavily and cranked his arm down toward the ground. Sukuna raised a brow. Izuku used all of his might to punch upward. The ground started to explode as the shockwave reached all the way back up to the surface. The ground in between both deep holes started to crumble. Sukuna had been sandwiched in the middle, which he quickly realized. He quickly started to use purple again to destroy the ground, which was now falling onto him. The purple exploded and Izuku's vision was blurred. When everything cleared up, the ground had fallen on top of Sukuna. Izuku smiled. "I did it." He looked up to see Ochako falling down toward him. She dragged dirt down on the sides with her to lessen the impact. Izuku started to smile but felt a searing pain through his legs. His eyes widened as he looked over to the dirt and saw it slowly raising. From the knees down, his legs had been sliced clean off. He fell to the ground and his body started to flame up. Sukuna walked through the tons of dirt. On one of his fingers was red. It threw the dirt around and Sukuna spit out dirt from his mouth. "Not happening," he muttered as he looked to Izuku. "I'm not letting more strong people exist. I'll kill you, then the girl, then all for one." Izuku with tears in his eyes looked to Sukuna. "What do you get out of that? Do you truly need to be the strongest?" Sukuna had a deadpan look on his face. "You know how it feels, don't you, to just be a weapon?" Izuku was confused. "Don't tell me you're trying to give me a sob story now." He laughed, but Sukuna kicked him in the jaw. Ochako landed on the ground and threw a punch at Sukuna, but Sukuna used the red in his hand to repel it, making Ochako's arm snap into multiple pieces. She fell on her back and breathed heavily. "There have been so many of the strongest for a long time. It was me, then Satoru Gojo. Now there are more than one of you. All for One has only been kept at bay because of me. I took over this body so that Tenko Shimura couldn't make the same mistakes as me or Satoru Gojo, but you I haven't been able to keep track of." Sukuna then glanced over at Ochako. "And you were never on my radar, but now maybe you're the only one who can help." Sukuna then looked back to Izuku, who felt blood leaving his body. "You've never been treated as a human, have you? You've been feared like a rabid animal." Izuku thought back to when he was on the street. He was unknown, but the ones who did know him feared him. He thrived on that fear, but ever since he came to Udate, that was enhanced. All of the students for a good period of time were afraid of him. He was an outcast. But not to her. Izuku looked over to Ochako, who was looking back at him with tears flowing down her face. "Yeah," Izuku coughed out to Sukuna. "Then you understand why you're a liability. I was the same in my era. I became feared, and I won't let you become me. I chose to go north. I'll never let one of us go south again. We're not the same. I made friends." Izuku pushed his upper body up using his arms. He slingshot himself to Sukuna and punched him in the face before crashing back onto the ground. The entire ground shook from Izuku's punch. Sukuna pushed his dislocated jaw back into place. "You're no different. Gojo made friends as well, but he was still just a weapon. Until the minute he died to me. I'm not a good guy by any means, but I won't let any more of me exist for as long as the clock turns." Izuku felt his consciousness start to fade. His vision started to falter, and he coughed up blood. He looked over to Ochako and saw her crawling to him. "I won't let you die." Ochako mumbled to herself as she reached her hand out. Sukuna watched, and his eyes widened. Reverse curse technique started to beam out of Ochako's body and onto Izuku's. His legs quickly came back and his eyes opened wide. You really are special, Sukuna told Ochako, who glanced up at him and chuckled. The strongest, you might say? Sukuna scoffed. Now that you're involved with him, you must die as well. Then after all for one eliminates All Might, I can kill him and once again be the only strongest. I'll keep this world balanced just as I have since I was put back here. That's why I'm in this body, that's why I need the 6 eyes. Sukuna put his finger up and blue started to form. I kill for purpose now, and that isn't gonna change. He shot blue at Ochako, who tried to move, but her cursed energy vanished, and her eyes rolled into the back of her head. Not Ochako passed out and started to fall. Izuku felt his breathing speed up as he watched blue near Ochako. No. Die. The ground that was above Izuku, Ochako, and Sukuna exploded into pieces and were then burned to smithereens. A long tongue appeared and grabbed Ochako, pulling her up. Izuku's eyes widened and Sukuna looked up to the top of the ravine they had created. There stood Bakugo and Shoto, both breathing heavily. Bakugo, with his devilish smile, jumped down towards Sukuna. Shoto created a ramp of ice and the rest of Class A started to slide down. Sukuna growled to himself, but before he could move his hands, Izuku sliced both of them off with his own. Sukuna looked back to Izuku and saw him with a small grin on his face. I told you I had friends. Chapter 29. All Might used Black Whip to carry himself toward the edge of the ravine the others created. He was on the verge of unconsciousness. Ochako had killed All for One by slicing his head clean off with her hand alone, his arch nemesis taken down by a teenage girl. He peeked over the edge and saw Sukuna defending himself against multiple curse techniques. Shoto froze his newly regenerated hand as he went to use his domain expansion. A knife held by an invisible girl was stabbed through his heart, and he cringed. I could see her before what happened. They're all stronger, he thought as the knife was ripped back out of his heart. Sukuna looked over to another part of the ravine and saw a girl remaking spears at a fast rate. His eyes widened. They have a girl who can replicate cursed energy? Is that how they got the inverted spear of heaven to break through limitless even after I broke the other one? Sukuna started to smile as he turned back to Izuku, who met him with a punch to the face. I am the strongest and I did feel ostracized for so long. Izuku punched him again and a shockwave swept through the ravine. For so many years nobody would look at me. Another punch. I hated them because they never wanted me. Another punch. I never met my parents. Another punch. I never got to go to school. Another punch. The other students backed away as Izuku's punches got stronger. I never got to know what it was like to be loved. Another punch. There were so many things I didn't get to do. Another punch. Izuku's voice lowered as Sukuna fell onto his back and struggled to breathe. But now I can. Sukuna watched Izuku stand over him. I get it, Ryaman Sukuna. Sukuna looked at him confused. You don't want me to be like you, but unlike you I've started to have the things I yearned for. I don't feel ostracized anymore. I'm looked at every day by all of my friends. I go to school. I finally feel loved. Sukuna watched as tears from Izuku's eyes started to fall. I won't let you take that from me. He sniffled and wiped his nose. No matter what. Sukuna thought back to when he was fighting Yuji Itadori hundreds of years previously. Sukuna, it's time we end. Yuji coated his hand with cursed energy and stared into Sukuna's soul. This cycle of curses. Black flash. The curse of Sukuna lay on the ground, hopeless to regain control of Megumi Fushiguro. Sukuna, you are me. We're born into this world unconsciously shouldering curses. What sort of monster you turn into is entirely decided by your luck. Sukuna, let's try this one more time. Living not by cursing someone, but by existing alongside them. Even if no one will accept you, I'll live with you. Yuji slowly morphed into Izuku, who was holding his hand out to Sukuna. It had been Izuku the entire time, unknowingly saying the exact words said to Sukuna hundreds of years prior. I'm the strongest and I know how you feel, join me. Class A looked at Izuku. What the hell are you talking about? Bakugo mouthed as Ochako opened her eyes. Sukuna slowly smiled and closed his eyes. My job here is done, kill me. Take the 6 eyes out, as long as he exists there will be a threat to the society you want to maintain, just as I have. Izuku's hand flinched and he chuckled. Never thought I'd hesitate to kill someone who almost killed me countless times. I'll grant your wish. Izuku pushed his hand through Sukuna's chest, and the man grit his teeth in pain. I've got it from here, Izuku said with Sukuna smiling and nodding. Good luck, Sukuna said before Izuku crushed the man's heart and ripped it out of his chest so that he couldn't regenerate. Izuku felt his heart rate slow and his body become heavy. He slowly fell backwards and landed on his back. He looked to his side and saw Ochako with tears flowing down her face. Izuku chuckled. Hey. Ochako sniffled and put one of her hands onto his cheek, pulling herself closer to him and putting her forehead against his. Hey. Sirens started to blare in the distance as the two fell unconscious. Chapter 30. December 25th. Christmas Day. 24 days after All for One's attack. Izuku slowly opened his eyes and groaned. He blinked a few times and tried to sit up. His body struggled, but he managed to. You're awake. Izuku moved only his eyes over and saw All Might sitting on a chair. As Izuku became more aware, he realized he was in the hospital. Hey, Izuku tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. You've been out for a little over 3 weeks. All Might continued as he stood up. Izuku's eyes widened. You are Yura. He tried but couldn't speak. All Might nodded. Uraraka is okay. She overexerted herself during the battle and passed out, but she's alive. She woke up around 2.5 weeks ago. She's just sore now. She had gotten access to cursed energy she didn't even know she had. She pushed her body to the limits. All Might smiled. I'm proud of both of you. Once you're well enough to stand, I will be showing you your new home I purchased as a gift. Izuku slowly smiled and looked around the room. Aha, Izuku coughed as he tried to speak. Have to see her, he continued as he started to sit up in his bed. All Might shook his head. I had a feeling you'd say that. Izuku started to rip wires off of him and stood up. His legs were slightly wobbly and he grabbed onto the windowsill nearby to keep himself steady. He breathed out heavily and blinked hard. Before All Might could say another word, Izuku disappeared from his sight, the wind causing papers to fly into the air. All Might laughed and left the hospital room himself. Izuku jumped from building to building toward the battle site. His body was screaming at him to stop, but he kept going. He landed on a building that was right next to Yue. Izuku looked down and saw the ravine. The school was almost completely destroyed, but he saw cars in the parking lot and the dorms still intact. He slid down the side of the building and ran to the dorms. He burst open the door. There he saw a bunch of strangers who looked like they were unpacking their things. He froze as the room full of people looked at him. I'm Class 2A, he said with a voice that sounded like he had smoked a pack a day since he was born, to which the room nodded. Wait, it's only December, are you guys the new class? He asked them, in which they nodded. Damn, where's 3A dorms? The group shrugged. None yet, Class 3A are all at home, they said to Izuku, who sighed. All right, he said as silence fell through the room. Izuku then disappeared and the others sighed before continuing to move into the dorms. Izuku got onto the tallest building in the city and looked around. The noises that were previously so loud for him were gone. He hadn't lost his restriction, his senses were still heightened, but he couldn't hear the voice in his head, or the voices surrounding him. Izuku? Izuku's head shot back and he saw Ochako standing there with a confused look on her face. What the hell are you doing here? Izuku stuttered and Ochako giggled. I come here to calm down every day since the big fight. Didn't expect to see you here though. When did you wake up? Ochako asked Izuku as he walks toward her. Izuku couldn't get any words out as he reached a spot where he and Ochako were face to face. Thank you, Izuku said to the girl who was mildly confused. Why what? She said to the boy who breathed in heavily. He slowly backed up and then bowed down in front of her. Without you I'd be dead, so thank you so much. He felt tears well up in his eyes and a few fell to the ground. Ochako saw this and a small sympathetic smile appeared on her face. She walked to him and put her index finger and thumb on his chin before bringing him back up to a standing position. It was my job as a comrade, so there's no need to thank me, she said with the boy shaking his head in response. No thank you for everything I'm saying. If you never treated me like you did, I wouldn't be here. I'd still be on the street with nobody, I'd still be alone. Izuku's voice cracked as more tears started to fall down his face. You showed me that I can be normal, that I won't end up like Sukuna or Gojo. I'm not just a weapon, I'm a human. Izuku slowly started to smile. So thank you for showing me how to live. Ochako felt tears welling up in her eyes as well and she chuckled. Didn't know you could get that sappy, she said as she put her arms out to her sides. Izuku laughed and nodded. Me either, I'm embarrassed, he said as he looked at her. A small blush came across Ochako's face as she clasped her hands. Are you gonna? She said with Izuku just looking at her confused. Ochako giggled. Hug me, dummy, she said with her arms still out. Izuku blushed a bit and chuckled as he wrapped his arms around her upper back and pulled her close. Sorry if I'm bad at this, I've never really hugged anyone before, he said as she rested her head against his chest. She just smiled. Don't worry, I think we'll be able to practice plenty. Izuku blushed but held her closer while smiling. Merry Christmas, by the way, Ochako said to the boy as she slowly started to back away. Izuku frowned at the feeling of her leaving him. Yeah, Merry Christmas. Are you going back home now or? Ochako shook her head. My parents are with family right now, I could go back, yeah. Ochako reached her hand out for Izuku to hold, and he did so relatively quickly. But I think I'd rather stay here. Ochako squeezed down on his hand. Izuku smiled and squeezed back. Yeah, me too. Ochako walked around Izuku and stood in front of him. She held both of his hands. Izuku felt his heart beating as Ochako smiled. Do you have anything to say? She asked Izuku, who audibly gulped, making Ochako giggle. Can I kiss you? Ochako's giggle turned to a laugh and she let go of Izuku's hands to hold her stomach as she laughed. Ah man, you're so cute, Ochako said to Izuku, who chuckled nervously. Yes, you can. Ochako closed her eyes and a blush spread across her already rosy cheeks. Izuku blinked a few times. I don't know where to go from here, Izuku said as he put his hands on her cheeks. Ochako squinted her eyes open. You want me to take the lead? She asked in a whisper with Izuku quickly nodding. Ochako slowly put Izuku's hands down to her waist before pushing herself against him. She got on her tippy toes and tilted her head slightly to the side. I missed you while you were asleep, Ochako said as she stared into the boy's eyes. Izuku staring at her lips and smiled. Thank you for making me feel loved, he said again with her just smiling back and placing her lips on his. Izuku looked at the girl as she kissed him. Everything about her made me feel an emotion he could barely describe. She peeked one eye open and her blush deepened. You're supposed to close your eyes, she said as she backed away and looked to the side, embarrassed that he was staring at her. I'm sorry, but I couldn't not look at you, I don't know why. Ochako shook her head and sighed. So you wanna? Izuku cut her off. Let's go on a date, I mean, do you wanna go out with me? Ochako nodded. Yeah, I do. I feel like we skipped a few steps before kissing, but that's okay. To new beginnings, right? Izuku nodded and the two jumped to the ledge on the end of the building. They looked down at the city. The two slowly locked hands. Izuku smiled. The battle was over, but he still had so much life to live. Especially now that he had Ochako and all of his other friends by his side. He was strong enough to be just a weapon, but he wasn't. He finally was loved and he finally embraced it, falling in love in the process. He wasn't going to be like the other strongest, he'd be free. No restrictions besides the heavenly one bestowed on him at birth involved. Izuku looked over to Ochako, who was looking back at him. Yeah, He squeezed down on her hand as a soft grin spread across his face. To new beginnings.
Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.